Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Asking Better Questions, interview tips from Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot. My name is Lisa Kapoor. I am a litigation attorney at Holland & Knight, and it is my honor to serve as chair of the Young Lawyers Division of the Federal Bar Association's Chicago chapter. Before I introduce today's speakers, I want to start by encouraging each of you to become a member of the FBA's Chicago chapter. Membership in the FBA has many benefits. First, our chapter has a notably high level of involvement from our federal bench. Thus, membership in the FBA is a great way to get better acquainted with our local federal judges. Yesterday evening, for example, we hosted part one of this program by having a networking reception and screening of Death on the Nile at AMC Block 37 downtown. We were joined by several federal practitioners and young lawyers, as well as a few federal judges. Second, today's enlightening program is typical of the high-quality CLE that our chapter regularly offers. Third, in a typical year, we host popular informal luncheons with federal judges in their chambers, as well as a number of free events for our members, including our holiday party and our ethics program, offering many hours of free professional responsibility credit, which can be hard to come by. And those are just a few examples, and there are many more. So I encourage you to consider joining the FBA-Chicago's chapter, the FBA's Chicago chapter. And if you're interested, please see our website at www.fedbarchicago.org/membership. Next, I want to remind everyone that we will share a CLE code at some point during this presentation. Please be sure to write down or record the code if you wish to obtain CLE credit for this program. Finally, I want to encourage you all to submit questions via the webinar platform. CLE programs are always enhanced through audience participation. So please do take advantage of the opportunity to ask questions as soon as they come to your mind by placing them in the questions drop-down box. Without further ado, I want to move forward to our program. Today, I am joined by Stephen Lee, an experienced trial lawyer and litigator who is currently at Benesch. Stephen presently concentrates on managing False Claims Act cases, white-collar criminal defense cases, healthcare investigations, and governmental investigations. Before landing at Benesch, Stephen was a assistant United States attorney in Chicago for 11 years. Stephen, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Lisa. Happy to be here.
We are also joined by Professor Dean Nelson. Dean is the founder and director of the journalism department at Point Loma Nazarene University. He has over 40 years of experience in journalism. He's authored articles for the New York Times, the Boston Globe, San Diego Magazine, and either written or co-authored more than 14 books. He even recently wrote a book called Talk to Me, How to Ask Better Questions. Great plug, Stephen. How to ask better questions, get better answers, and interview anyone like a pro. Dean, thank you for joining us today as well.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be with you, and thank you, Stephen, for that product placement right before we even begin.
Perfect. Chef.
Available on Amazon, I'm pretty sure.
Yes, they are. When it comes to seeking guidance about asking better questions or conducting better witness interviews, Stephen and Dean are the experts, and I'm just here to facilitate this discussion. And with that, I will turn over the screen to Stephen and Dean.
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks to the FBA for having us here. I hope everyone enjoys this program. We've had a lot of fun putting it together. I think a lot of this comes from kind of, our thinking that interviewing is a really important skill for lawyers, but there's actually very little training about this in law schools, and I think a lot of times at law firms. There's lots of training for topics like cross-examination or expert depositions, but lawyers, litigators, especially young litigators, you're probably going to actually conduct many more interviews, just witness interviews over the time of your career, getting to understand what your clients are the problems they're facing, getting to understand how to help them solve those problems. And so that's something that we thought a lot about. And we also thought about how maybe one of the issues might be that in law school, we're taught more by looking at case studies, particularly judicial opinions, because those are what are readily available. And how for interviews, there aren't as many interviews out there for people to look at and study and really see how what worked well, what didn't work well. But then we started thinking about this some more and started thinking that actually one way of approaching this is actually looking at fictional interviews that people have read for fun. Millions of people have read Agatha Christie's novels and have read interviews. And so we thought it'd be interesting to take a look at some of those, to use those as examples for how to talk about asking better questions. And so that's part of what brought us here today and what we want to talk about. Now, in my role as an attorney, it helps me to think about, there's 3 types of interviews that I think are actually, that I have used pretty frequently in the course of my time as a lawyer. It's a little different as a journalist, and that's something that Dean will talk about in a minute. But as a lawyer, I consider like 3 main types of interviews. First of all, I think basically the first main type, and the type you probably will do the most often, is what I call investigative or fact-gathering interviews. And this is kind of the most like what journalists do in the normal course, where you're basically going out there and really trying to just get information, like what happened, right? What happened? What did you see? What did you hear? What do you know? And that, I think, is just one big broad type of interview. And that covers fact witnesses as well as maybe expert witnesses. Now, a second type of interview that comes up, I think, more often in law enforcement settings, criminal cases, and comes up a lot on TV in movies, is what's called, I think, interrogations. And that's different from fact-gathering interviews. And I think that's partially what people, I think, get confused about, because interrogations are not about gathering factual information to really underlie the case. Interrogations are usually done later in the case when the investigator is reasonably certain that the person they're talking to was involved in committing a crime and is trying to get a confession that will basically help seal the case and help get this case to be resolved by a plea instead of by a trial. That's the point of an interrogation, and I think that's very different. And this is used primarily by police and law enforcement agents, sometimes by lawyers. Now, this type of interview can be very effective, but it can also be abused when used at the wrong time and in the wrong setting. And I think that's something that we've seen kind of over the course of the past few years and from various examples in real life. A great example of this can actually be seen in a TV show, the show When They See Us, which shows kind of what happened when police conducted interrogations of the young men who were suspected of a violent crime early on in the investigation, when the police didn't really have such a strong case, but they were still trying to get a confession anyway. Okay, so that's a second type of interview that I see a lot in the lawyer context. The third type of interview is something that I definitely did not know about or think about when I was starting off my legal career, but I thought a lot about since then. And that's what I call locking in. This is the type of interview you use when you know the person you're talking to is lying to you, okay? And they're just lying to you. And so you're not talking to them to get information that's actually useful for building the case. You're not trying to do that. What you want to do is you want to lock them into their story. So you can later on come back and show the jury or the finder of fact or someone that this person was flat out lying. And that way you could help show that their testimony is not credible, or to show that they're actually guilty of a crime or guilty of something because they flat out lied to you when you were interviewing them. So this is something that I think, and this is something I think is important because, one, I did not know this when I was starting off my legal career, and I gotta admit, the first time that someone just flat out lied to me during the middle of a trial, I gotta admit, I wasn't quite sure how to respond to that. So I've thought a lot about that since then. But this is something, what I find is that people can generally pull off a lie for a little bit. Locking in is important because it is harder to pull off a lie over the long haul. And what they do is people start to make mistakes. They start to say things that you can disprove later on. So I think this is a third type of interview that I've used quite a bit in criminal cases. And I think it's pretty important to keep in mind as you go about things. So that's what I consider like the 3 main types of interviews that lawyers and litigators, I think, will use during the normal course. There's kind of a fourth type of interview that Hercule Poirot does, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But I want to turn to Dean to maybe talk about kind of the different types of people that he interviews or may want to interview as a journalist, to kind of looking at it from that perspective and get that journalistic take.
Yeah, thank you. It's really interesting to see the parallels between law and journalism. We have different purposes, clearly, but the methods that we use to talk to people are often really similar. Where they diverge a little bit is on the interrogation part. I think when we've seen journalists turn more into interrogators, I think that's problematic. That I don't think that's our job, is to be the to turn these into interrogations. What we're after is information, and also what we're after, and maybe this is a little bit different from legal practice, is we're also after kind of the human story. We're the human voice, the understanding of a situation, the complexity of it all. But what we're after, in my book, Talk to Me, I say basically where journalists are looking for information from people can be broken down into three categories. One would be eyewitnesses. These are the people who saw something. Journalists, we're rarely at an event that we're writing about. So we have to talk to people who were there. So we talk to eyewitnesses, or another word might be stakeholders, people who have been affected or the impact is on of an event is on them. Another group of people that we talk to are experts. And when I say experts, typically I'm saying these are people who have kind of the official version. These are the spokespeople, these are public information officers perhaps, or somebody who is in a position of saying, here's the official version of what happened. And then the other group that we look to, I would call, are explainers. People who can give you background and maybe just a little more of the complexity and the nuance behind it. So we have kind of a different purpose oftentimes, but the practice of talking to people and getting people to give us good information is very, very similar.
Thanks, Dean. It's something that I forgot to mention earlier. I myself actually was a reporter before I became a lawyer, so that's something that
I think that's pretty important, Stephen, that you bring that up. Don't hide from your past.
But I think that's actually served me very well. And the fact that, part of I think what I would highly recommend is you get better at it. You get better at this the more you do it. I think interviewing is an actual skill. It's something that I would highly encourage young lawyers, young litigators, law students to actually look for opportunities, because I think you just get better at it the more you do it. And so I think just keep that in mind as you proceed.
One great question, Dean, that I think I'd like to ask you before Stephen moves on. Do you find yourself as a journalist ever having to use the latter two techniques that Stephen mentioned? Because it's clear that your questioning involves the investigative interviews, you're gathering facts, you're talking to eyewitnesses and experts. Do you ever find yourself as a journalist trying to lock people into a lie or to conduct interrogations in your work?
It's a good question. My own experience has been is if you can show the source that you're talking to how well prepared you are, that it is really clear my personal feeling is in a lot of interviews, maybe not with eyewitnesses, but with a lot of interviews, you should probably already know the answers to the questions. So really what you're after is you're trying to get that kind of personal perspective, maybe some great anecdotes, something like that. But if you can show the person, Lisa, that you have prepared really, really well, you've reduced the tendency for someone to think that they can lie to you. And so a lot a lot of this can be maybe mitigated at the front end. But that said, if you think that they are going to lie, and again, you might have this sense ahead of time, I think you have to have that sort of gotcha question every now and then built into your plan. The thing is, anybody who has that there's something thorny in their past or something that they suspect you're going to ask them, my personal feeling is you're obligated to ask them that question. They know what's coming. They're ready. And so I don't know that I do much in the I caught you in a lie, as opposed to let's really get at what's going on here. And my sense is if I think you're going to lie, I probably already know it, and that's going to affect how I ask the questions.
All right, great. I guess one practice point coming off what Dean just said is, and I think part of the thinking about why we're doing this, why we hope this is useful, is like there are a lot of choices that go into doing an interview, and there is actually a lot of strategy that goes into things. For example, listening to Dean talk about the gotcha question, one big thing that I would strongly recommend is don't start with that question, right? You work your way up, okay? Because that happens both for reporters and for law enforcement and lawyers. If you start with that question, you might not get to ask any other questions, because people can often just basically say, okay, I'm shutting this down, or I'm taking the Fifth Amendment and this is over. So you work your way up. You try to build the rapport, you try to build up the rhythms before you get there. I've seen some people try to go straight to the gotcha question. It generally doesn't work. I generally don't find it works very well when that happens.
No, I completely concur. In fact, I usually try to strategically place the difficult question about 2/3 of the way in, because then I've got a whole bunch of useful material, and if it crashes and burns with that question, at least I've gotten a lot of good stuff ahead of time. But I do think there's sort of a trajectory to it. As you said, Stephen, I think you're absolutely right. You want those rapport building, gee, it's a small world kind of questions leading up to, and then they get maybe more and more difficult, and then you've got sort of that more difficult question. And then, but I think at the tail end of that, those questions are really important too, because then you want to have what I would consider sort of cool down kinds of questions as well. You don't want to just end it there unless your source wants to end it there.
All right, so that's some overview. We have a lot more tips that we're going to try offering throughout the course of this session, and but let's get into Death on the Nile. Lisa, for those of us who haven't seen the movie recently or read the book, do you want to help just get people back on track?
Absolutely. So Death on the Nile, for those who haven't watched the film, there will be spoiler alerts. Please do know that. Death on the Nile is a murder mystery film and book that follows the journey of newlyweds as they embark on their honeymoon along the Nile River aboard a glamorous steamboat. They are curiously joined by several friends and family members on their ride, and a world-famous detective, Hercule Poirot. Mr. Poirot's presence on the boat becomes central to the plot once the leading lady in the film, played by Gal Gadot, is murdered in her sleep by someone aboard the boat. I personally love the official synopsis, and I'm going to read it with an accent, so I hope you guys enjoy it. It reads, set against an epic landscape of sweeping Egyptian desert vistas and majestic Giza pyramids, this tale of unbridled passion and incapacitating jealousy features a cosmopolitan group of impeccably dressed travelers and enough wicked twists and turns to leave audiences guessing until the final shocking denouement. So Stephen and Dean, walk us through some of the interviews that take place in the film Death on the Nile and the book as well, and tell us what we can learn from Poirot's style of questioning. Thanks,
Lisa. All right, let me put on the screen. But yeah, in the course of the movie, so I'm going to start off by talking about the movie version. So in the movie version of Death on the Nile, what ends up happening is that Poirot basically interviews 8 people over the course of the movie. And in those interviews, and you can see actually the range a little bit. So some of the interviews are what I would call investigative fact-gathering interviews, but actually a lot of them, about half most of the interviews he conducts here, he uses a technique that I would strongly advise against using in real life. In a lot of these interviews, what he does is he actually basically quickly goes to throwing out speculative theories about how the witness the person he's talking to could have had a motive to commit the murder and might have had the opportunity to commit the murder, to see how they react. And this can work in some cases. It can work if you do kind of like, you're basically looking to get some kind of excited utterance, right? To see how the person reacts when exposed to shocking information. But I find that it works really only in very limited circumstances, and it generally doesn't really work in real life. So what then because in real life, a lot of people basically, well, one reason, basically people will basically be really offended and they will walk out of the interview and not give you the additional information that you're really looking for. Second of all, my experience has generally been that people don't break down and confess on the spot just because they get asked a question. He even asks one of the witnesses, the cousin, he even asked him straight out, like, did you kill her? This is what maybe a gotcha question, but I kind of consider this also like kind of like the ultimate question. This is what you're really trying to get. And in my experience, people generally don't answer those questions the way you might like them to. I have found that, I remember when I was a junior associate many, many years ago, I did see this one case. I was working on this one case where a partner did try to do that at the beginning of a deposition. I gotta admit, I was pretty skeptical back then, but I was the junior associate. And so, okay, we just went ahead and did it, and it did not work. It did not work, and it was a very unproductive interview and deposition. I did actually have a defendant confess during cross-examination in one of my trials. I was so surprised when it happened that I actually had to go over to my trial partner and ask her, did you just hear what I heard? Just to make sure, because I was not expecting that. She probably should have just pled guilty. But generally speaking, people don't answer those questions, don't respond well. And a lot of that actually kind of goes to, I think, what's something that we talked about, which is that you don't necessarily want to ask what we call the ultimate question a lot of times, especially as a lawyer. What you want to do is you want to get the building blocks for your argument, because you kind of know you're not going to get a confession. You're not going to get an admission to the key fact that's in dispute. What you want to do is try to get the little pieces, get the pieces you need for your argument, so that when you close, you can pull this all together without having the witness denying the ultimate question under oath. So that's something you might want to think about. Lisa?
Stephen, what does the ultimate question look like in civil cases? What types of questions should we avoid asking in civil matters? You know what I mean? Like, this is, did you murder her? That's the type of question we're seeing being answered or asked in death and denial. But practically, what are we going to be looking at?
Well, I think sometimes you want to think about the elements, right? You want to think about the elements, especially when you go for intent. You probably don't want to ask the question in a way that perfectly lines up with like the intent element of a criminal case or a civil case, because you want to have some wiggle room, right? Because especially intent is the kind of thing you often show through circumstantial evidence, right? So you're gonna look to the emails and the actions and things like that to build up why you think the defendant acted with the requisite intent or state of mind for a certain thing. And and they're going to look to other circumstantial evidence. And you might want to avoid asking the precise question, because then you give the others, they're going to deny it, right? And the other side will have an under oath, an under oath denial, and which they'll point to. So asking the ultimate question actually can backfire a lot and give the other side something to work with that you gave them because you asked. So that's something to think about. So first of all, so I think this interview technique, what I call the Poirot's technique of like, I would kind of call it almost like confrontation interviews, like, because they're not really interrogations. What he's not doing, and I think it's important to know, he's not doing interrogations in these interviews because he really doesn't have evidence, right? He doesn't have evidence. He hasn't accumulated things. He's not laying out the photos or the letters or the emails in front of the witness to show them that, you know what, you're done anyway, so you might as well confess. That's what interrogations are more like. He's just throwing out theories, and so he really doesn't have much there. So I would not consider them interrogations for the most part. The final interview is maybe a little different. He is more, that was getting closer to interrogation, but most of the interviews he does are more confrontation interviews. So, but I want to talk a bit more because I don't think, like I said, I don't think many people on this line are going to be doing confrontation interviews. So I want to talk about the interview of Louise Bourget, because I think that one's actually very interesting and I think a very good teaching point. So that's the interview of the maid who was the one who discovered the body in the first place. And so that is actually a very good example of a classic fact gathering interview, because that you're talking to someone who definitely has some useful factual information, and you know, and she makes sense because she's the one who discovered the body. So she is probably she is clearly one of the first people you would go to when talking to someone about this. So, but ultimately, both in the movie and in the book version, the novel version of Death in the Nile, Hercule Poirot actually made some pretty big mistakes in this interview. And I think that's why we want to talk about it, because I think it's useful sometimes to see not just what people do well, but also what people did poorly. Because I think sometimes you learn more from the second. So, and in fact, his handling of this interview of Louise Bourget actually helps lead to the two other murders that take place in the course of the novel and the movie, because he misses some pretty key information. So the key thing that happens here in this interview, the first key mistake, is that he interviews her in the presence of another person who has knowledge of the situation. Now, I think it's much better practice to interview each witness individually, so you get their version of events, their personal knowledge, without any potential contamination from talking to someone else. I think that's really important, because you have to do this early on, because people they're going to get their stories confused. People talk to other people, and then later on it gets very confusing as to, are they saying later on what they actually know, or what they heard from someone else, or what they assume based on what they heard from someone else or saw someone else say, or things like that. And so as a general matter, I think it's very important to talk to witnesses individually to really figure out what they know. Now, I think this is really important, especially for lawyers, to keep in mind, because as lawyers, when you're thinking about witnesses, you're trying to think ahead to like the trial or the deposition of their trial, maybe years in the future. And one of the big things is that people can only testify about things that they have personal knowledge of. If you're interviewing 3 people about the same series of events at the same time, it's going to be very confusing as to who actually knows what, or who actually has personal knowledge about what. So it's really important to actually interview people separately, I think, whenever possible. Now, there are times when you have to do it. You have to interview people kind of together, but I don't think it's a great idea, but try to avoid it if at all possible. And in this case, this had particularly tragic circumstances, because Poirot was interviewing Louise Bourget in the presence of the murderer. Now, he didn't know that. He didn't suspect the murderer at the time, but he was interviewing her in the presence of the murderer. Not a good idea. Not a good idea. And that's what leads to all these problems, because she has a total agenda that is totally apart from just answering Poirot's questions, because she's trying to figure out how to answer the questions, but also how to protect herself and try to see, can she gain advantage in this situation? So during the course of the interview, she actually sends messages to the murderer who's sitting right next to her. So let me go through that a little bit more. Okay, so now let's go through some of the questions and see how this plays out. So it starts off with a pretty decent first question, okay? So did you see the necklace when you came in this morning? It's a precise, factual question. Poirot is basically, he has a theory as to why the murder might have happened, and he's trying to evaluate that because the necklace is missing. And so he's trying to figure out, when did the necklace go missing? So that's a useful thing. It's a good, precise question to gather information. All right, the next question he asks her to explain a point that was kind of confusing to him. And this is kind of goes to back what Dean was saying, maybe explainers in some ways, though this is more fact gathering perhaps. Basically, he remembered hearing something that he thought was kind of odd, and he asked to make sure to understand, what did Lynette Doyle mean when she said this? Again, that's actually, I think, a very important type of question to ask, because a lot of times the interviewer and the witness might have different terminology in mind, might not be on the same page when it comes to certain terms or ideas. It's actually pretty useful to make sure you're on the same page. There's actually a great example from a Sherlock Holmes story where he asks a witness if the street was empty, and the witness says, yeah, it was empty as far as anyone who mattered does. And the Sherlock Holmes says, wait, what do you mean by that? And then he understands that actually the killer was actually there on the street, just the police officer totally ignored him because he didn't think the murderer merited anything. So that's a good question. That's good. The next, he asks for focuses on concrete actions. You know, what did you do after you left Ms. Doyle? What did you see? Did you hear anything? Things like good, solid, factual questions. And I think this is also good examples of he's trying to break it down, right? He's not just asking her, tell me what you know, right? Because I do see sometimes people just ask her, like, tell me what you know, what happened last night, which is too broad, too vague, and it puts way too much control of the interview in the witness's hands, because the witness doesn't know what's interesting or significant. Poirot, as the investigator, he should have a much better idea as to what's important. So he's directing the questions well. And I think in terms of just trying to get to the things that he thinks are relevant. And also, these are easier questions for the witness to answer, because she's not trying to project, well, what does he want to know? She's just answering what she did. Okay, and then here's where things go really wrong, okay? Because both in the movie and in the novel, when Poirot asks her, did you go anywhere else? Did you see or hear anything else? She gives a really weird answer, right? Basically saying, like, well, what do you mean? I mean, what do you, if I had gone outside, if I had been taking a smoke on the deck, I mean, I might have seen something, but like, you know, but how else could I possibly know anything? Now, generally speaking, when a witness gives a weird answer to your question, that's a big red flag and a big sign that something else is going on, and you got to slow down the interview and find out what is going on. What is this person really thinking? What's going on in their head? Is this something troubling or whatever? Instead, Poirot, he actually gets very aggressive, and he gets very annoyed with the witness. But you did not, or you did. What is this? So she is giving a weird answer, and he is reacting defensively, aggressively, in a way that basically isn't exploring why she's asking this weird answer, why she's giving this weird answer. And also, to be honest, I think, like, really in most cases, annoying the witness, right? To a way of putting the witness, you know, clearly drawing lines. Like, I'm not with you. You are someone I'm adverse to some degree. And so she ends up not revealing the truth, which is that she was there. She did see who went into the room last night, the prior night, and she did see, so she knows exactly who the killer is. So now, obviously, hindsight's easy. So whether Poirot really could have gotten the full answer, you know, with this interview, you know, obviously that's kind of hard to say. But a lot of the things he did in this interview actually really undercut the investigation. You know, he should have interviewed her by herself, right? In order to get the full answer without the potential of being contaminated by anyone. And he really should have, reacted much more, much better to that weird answer, which should have been a huge red flag to slow down the interview and figure out what's going on.
So Stephen, you mentioned a good point, and Professor Dean, I know that you want to ask or you want to make a statement, but I want to ask a question to you actually.
Go ahead.
So Stephen's mentioned a red flag. Your witness is evading the question or asking you questions to a question. What are some other red flags that lawyers should be looking for when they're questioning a witness that says, you know what, I better ask more questions about this because something's going on?
Yeah, there's some really interesting dynamics going on here. When you ask a question and the person you're interviewing responds with a question, you have a choice to make there, because my feeling is somebody in every interview, somebody is going to control it, and it always has to be you, always. And so what if you allow the other person to turn the tables a little bit, you have to gently, or maybe not so gently, regain control over who's really asking the questions here. I think a great example was in the confirmation hearings of Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. There were some really interesting exchanges here where he ended up asking the questions. And I think that was sort of a missed opportunity on some of the people who were actually in charge of the confirmation hearings to just let him know, actually, we're the ones asking the questions here. So I think you can, you've got to just say, you're the one who's in charge of this interview. The other thing I wanted to bring up about this is the question, did you go anywhere else or see or hear anything else? I mean, those are really what I would call closed-ended questions. Those are yes, no questions. There's a better way to ask that question. Instead of, did you go anywhere else? Why not ask, where else did you go? And that then gives that person an opportunity to either say where else she went or didn't go or whatever. And instead of saying, did you see or hear anything? I think a better one would be, what did you see? What did you hear? And then that draws the person out a little bit. So Lisa, did I address your question?
Absolutely, absolutely. And Stephen, I know you're going to get ready to head to the next interview, but before you cover the next one, we have a great question from the audience. Someone has asked, what are the significant differences between strategy and techniques for an interview versus a deposition? And they go on to say a deposition is a recorded formal interview, but it's also one where the interviewee is compelled to answer your questions.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of times deposition is really just a very formal interview, right? So it's not, I think there you want to, I think that's so, I think a lot of the same ideas that we've talked about and can talk about further, apply. You want to maintain control, you want to take, time and strategy, be strategic about when you get to certain topics. I actually find, and this is something, one thing I find for interviews and depositions that I think is very useful is both interviews and depositions is actually, that early part of the interview where you're kind of going through the biography of the person, like getting their education, credentials, I think is actually much more important than people sometimes realize, because this is where you actually start to understand, get a better sense of the person before you get to anything, the really controversial stuff. Because the education, the background, that should be very smooth, right? And so that's when you build a little bit of rapport, you look for opportunities to do those little things that help you get a better sense of the person. And you actually build a really nice baseline before you get to the hard stuff. And I have found in some of my interviews and depositions that it's actually been very effective to see how much the person's tone and body language changes between the biography part and then the tricky part, because they get so defensive, their memory gets so bad, but you have the baseline already. So you know that they actually do have a pretty good memory for the stuff that matters. Another thing that just in terms of depositions, especially in depositions, the one really good advantage of that as opposed to interviews is you have more time, right? I mean, usually, because you're not as worried about the person just walking out on you or cutting it off. Well, assuming you don't totally, I mean, obviously there's time limits on depositions, but generally speaking, you hopefully have a good amount of time. The big thing that I think lawyers really need to keep in mind when doing interviews is to really get the little details. I think people a lot of times cut to the chase or gloss over things. They want to get to the ultimate issue more quickly. But I find that actually doing the little things is really what helps, because that gives you all the pieces you need for later on. So I think that's something, especially in the depositions, you actually have more control over, so you can kind of get that. Like, no. Tell me about this email, right? Who sent it? But things like that. You can really pin people down on the details more than you can in just like a more informal interview.
Agreed. I just want to make one note. In interviews, I feel that I focus more on rapport building than in a deposition, because you don't want that person to leave the room. And so it's strategically, I'm already a warm person generally, but I'm very warm to the individual, very polite, make sure they have water, the little small things that matter a lot and help the person feel that they can trust you and give you information. And they're more willing to provide information and sit there and go through the process. Another point, strategically speaking, in both scenarios, both depositions and interviews, ask about other people. If these witnesses and deponents can provide names of other people where you can obtain facts relevant to your case, definitely ask, okay, who sent this? And who else might know information about this particular issue? And who else was with you when this happened? Those are all very key questions. But I know that we're pushing it on time, and I want you to be able to continue, Stephen. So please do tell us about the next interview.
All right, so let's go to the next interview for the movie. Okay, and so this one's different, because this one doesn't actually, so the movie, what happens in the movie and the novel there's all these characters in the novel who kind of get consolidated or written out of the book in the movie, just because obviously the movie's got to be be more streamlined. So what ends up happening is, so in the course of the investigation, Hercule Poirot eventually realized that his friend Book actually knows stuff and is hiding something. So he ends up interviewing his friend. Okay, and so this is where, in this interview, these are the questions he asks during the course of the interview. Now, what I think is so again, this one starts off with, again, Hercule Poirot makes a huge mistake because he interviews Book in the presence of Simon Doyle, the husband of the victim, who is also the murderer of the victim. Now, this is pretty bad, but it kind of goes to the idea that, like, when you do an interview, because Poirot mentions this, how he wants to have a witness with him when he's doing an interview. That actually is pretty important, because what you want to have happen is, you don't want it to be, if you actually get a useful point, you don't want it to be interviewer versus subject. He said, he said, he said, she said, she said, she said. You want to actually have it something where you actually have another person to back you up. And so what actually happens, and back in my journalism days, I never had the resources to have a second person with me, but as a lawyer, generally speaking, you're going to conduct interviews in the presence of another person. The other person will be there to, one, help take notes so that you can focus on asking questions, but also help so you'll have two people who will say the person said something if they do make an important point and then later deny it. This is actually something the FBI typically does. If you ever watch a TV show and you see an FBI agent interviewing someone just by themselves, that actually isn't how the FBI typically works. They generally will have a second person there because they know that they need the corroboration. So first mistake of doing that, And then on top of things, probably not to interview someone in the presence of the murderer. So, I mean, just, I throw that out there for whatever it's worth. So that's there. Now, there's two questions in particular that I think are particularly interesting and I want to talk about just to move this along. So the first question is, there's this great moment in the movie where Poirot is talking to his friend and then he asks him, "Where is your coat?" And you can see Book suddenly, like, he deflates, right? Suddenly everything changes because Poirot asked this one question. Now, what's good about that is that I find that when you're doing an interview, the interviewer should not reveal much actual information. If the interviewer is telling the witness things, I think that's really bad. I think that's kind of like the interviewer should not be talking very much during the course of the interview, or it should be much more outweighed by the subject than by the witness. But and you don't want to infect them with information that you know. But but you do want to signal, and it is important to signal in some interviews that you know what's going on. You know what's really happening. So don't lie to me. Don't give me the runaround. He asked this question because he wants Book to know, I know what happened. I know you got rid of your coat, and I know you got rid of your coat for a reason. So I'm asking this question because you got to just come clean, right? Let's cut to the chase. So that was done far better than Poirot telling him, hey, I figured out, I know you've been wearing your coat all the time, and now your coat's gone, and I figured out that you must have been standing in this one spot and your coat got covered with blood, and now you got rid of it because you want to hide some secret. No, that would not be a good technique. But asking the right question to show that you know what's going on and to gain and regain control of the interview, that was well done. Okay, the next question I think is really actually very interesting is, again, kind of like this is a pretty smart question. Why did you not wake Lynette when Simon was shot? And I think this is a useful question here because he is focusing on inconsistent behavior. Because he picked up on when you're doing kind of any case, I mean, pretty much any case that involves litigation, you're dealing with this situation where something has happened that shouldn't have happened, right? If you're dealing with a breach of contract, no one people weren't expecting, the relationship broke down. If you're dealing with a criminal case, it's because someone committed a crime and obviously shouldn't have done that. Here, so it's really important to know the baseline and how things normally are supposed to go and how people normally act, because it helps highlight the weird, inconsistent things that can really show a lot. Now here, again, Poirot knew. He's showing what he knows. He knows that his friend Book is a kind, generous person who is so thoughtful that he would inform the former fiancée of Louise Bourget of her death after she got killed, but didn't wake up Lynette Doyle during the course of all the events the prior night. That's an inconsistent behavior that he thought about, and which is telling. So something is going on. Why didn't he do that? That's a big thing. Now, I think he could have built up to this a little better, and maybe in real life he would have, by kind of going through some of the questions Dean was asking, like going through his account of the night, confirming that he went into the room, or get him to lie that he didn't go in the room before you get to this question. But it's a movie, right? So, but I think that idea of looking for inconsistent behavior and asking, why didn't you do something that you normally would have done? Why didn't you do this thing? That's a really good question that I think can come up a lot in real life cases. So yeah, so I don't know, Dean, Lisa, any thoughts more on the Book interview?
Well, I would say that the where is your coat question is, I think you're absolutely right. It's a wonderful question, but I would say there are ways to ask that question without even having to ask a question. You can let the person know that you know way more than you're letting on. I've done this as a journalist where, let's say I'm interviewing an author I've done this actually. I interviewed a football coach, a major football coach whose name everyone would know. And I just wanted to let him know, don't spin me, don't lie to me, don't BS me. And the way I was able to communicate that was I found out this very obscure fact about him, about what his favorite book was. And it was, you know, it was a cheesy book. And I bought a copy of that book and had it with me when I interviewed him. And I just set it on his desk and set my recorder on top of it. And then the interview began. And that way I didn't have to waste any time by saying, don't even think about lying to me. I'm saying to him, I'm so ready for you. I even know this really obscure fact about you. So my point is, you can ask the where is your coat question without having to ask it.
That's impressive. So I have no comments about the book interview. I just want to give the CLE code for our attendees. The CLE code is 22294. Once again, that's 22294. And then Stephen, I don't know if you want to kind of do a comparison of the book and the novel, or if you want to go to the you.
So first of all, for those of you who are on here, we do have some handouts where we kind of go into a little bit more detail, breaking down the novel versions of some key interviews. And we also have a breakdown of one of the interviews from Murder on the Orient Express, one of the other famous Agatha Christie novels. I don't think we have time to go into that so much, but I just want to point that out for people, because I think we do go through more of the back and forth. But I thought what I'd do is, I do want us to cover some wrap-up questions, some practical pointers, but I do want to take a moment and just kind of look at another one of the interviews from the novel, just to kind of go through that. So again, in the movie, you know, there's a lot of streamlining, a lot of cutting the chase, right? So basically, it's very quick. Some of the scenes are very quick. But in the novel, those interviews, he does go through a lot of interviews where he really just trying to get the basic facts of the case. And I think that's actually pretty useful. And I just want to show a little bit of that to kind of just to cover a few points I think are useful for lawyers. Again, we have more detail in the handouts. But so in the novel, what he does is the first interview he actually does in the novel is he talks to the two eyewitnesses who were there when the whole confrontation happened the night before, that kind of established Jacqueline de Beauclair's alibi. And so he interviews these two people, Cornelia Robson and James Thanthorpe. Okay, and so a few quick practical points on this interview, and you can study this more in the handout. First of all, again, this kind of goes back to the earlier point I was making. He's interviewing two people at the same time. It is very confusing and hard to keep track, right? Because they're talking over each other, they're answering questions that the other person should have answered. It's not a good form. It would be better if he had interviewed them separately. There are times when we move it along. He should have interviewed them both separately. Okay, but it starts off okay with decent questions, but then you get to this one question, and then you get to, okay, but a few practical points. He confirms that there are 4 people in the room when the big incident he's trying to figure out happened. And then he asks, what were you all doing? And then he starts getting this really long kind of answer that kind of goes all over the place. Again, that's okay. It probably would have been better to break it down. What were you doing? What was Thanthorpe doing? What was Mr. Doyle doing? Break it down. It's actually easier for the witness, and you're going to get clearer testimony or information, and you're also going to make sure you don't miss something, because you just hear it because she's just going on, right? And she's kind of not necessarily giving stuff that really fits exactly with what he's looking for. And this is especially the case when she describes the whole incident, where, as she's just going through things, she says, Cornelia Robson gives this exchange covering like basically so many events all in one big burst, right? And she doesn't, and it's pretty confusing actually, and it's hard to track. And what Poirot should have done is he should have slowed it down and said, okay, wait, that was very helpful. Let me break that down. I want to take it step by step. Tell me what What did you do? What did she do? Okay, then what happened? How do you know that happened? What did she say? Okay, because, and also here's the thing, because this is the point in the novel where he clearly misses something. And this goes to an important point, I think, is for you to remember. As Robson's describing what happened, she talks about how Simon Joel got up and then the gun went off and shot him through the leg. Okay, now that was a reasonable assumption based on what she observed, but she didn't actually see the bullet go through the leg because it didn't, right? And that was the whole setup. Now, maybe Poirot could have picked up on it, maybe not, but it is much easier to miss a key point when you have a long, long answer to a simple question. And one big thing.
So Stephen, I want you to tell us what that's like. So if you get a response like this from a witness, what do you say? So you say, okay, the gun went off and it shot him. Where did the bullet shoot him? And where did the bullet go afterward? And when he starts to say, one of the servants heard the noise of the shot. Okay, which servant was it? What type of questions should he be following up on?
Well, I think two big thoughts. First of all, when a witness tells me something like this, I say, okay, whoa, that was great, but I need to slow that down. I need to make sure I understand. So I actually put it on me. I'm a bit confused. You need to help me understand things. I want to take it step by step. So let's go back. And I'll do things like I'll ask them to go step by step, or I will sometimes do a leading question to say, look, I think if I understand it right, this happened next, right? Do I have that right? And then, okay, and then they say, and then either they'll say yes, or they might say, oh yeah, but there's this other detail, right? And that's a way of slowing it down. The big question that Poirot didn't ask here, and I think a lot of lawyers miss, is how do you know what you just told me? How do you know that? Because that is key. Because a lot of times what witnesses do, and this case is an extreme example, but a lot of times witnesses will tell you things that they don't actually know, but they assume or they fill in the blanks because they know some of the other pieces, or they know, well, it had to have been this way because this happened. Lawyers, a lot of us are probably giving the example of how do you know it's raining if you don't see it, right? But like, it's better, again, just like in a courtroom, you could testify like, I was in a room, I came out, and there are all these puddles everywhere. But you have to argue that it was raining, right? If you didn't actually see it raining, you shouldn't testify that it was raining. So, but I do think one of the big things I think I see a lot of people glossing over and missing is, how do you know what you just said? And that's a great question to keep in mind in interviews or depositions, because that really a lot of that even goes to admissibility, because if they didn't actually observe it, it doesn't even come in. And I think that's the question like here. Now again, obviously this was an extreme case. They were setting up a pretty good alibi, so Poirot might have missed it even if he had done a better interview. But that's, this kind of information dump is something you want to avoid in an interview, because it's just too much, and you're obviously missing some detail here that's important.
I would totally agree. And in fact, I wouldn't wait until the end and say, let's go back. I would just stop in the middle of it and just say, wait a second, you lost me here. Can you clarify this? This isn't quite making sense. I think you're perfectly legitimate, both in law, but especially in journalism, to go for the clarification immediately.
So one more practice point I want to put out there for this interview, because again, it's in the novel, and I think it's actually pretty interesting, and this is, I think, practical for lawyers. So there's this point in the interview at the end. So he finishes up getting the details of what happened and what Danforth and Robson observed, and then at the end he says, "Oh yeah, now I want to know something about you two." Right? Now, first of all, I think you generally do that at the beginning of an interview, not at the end of an interview. Because you want to get the baseline. You want to know who this person is and how credible they are and how knowledgeable they are. Like, you want to get a sense of them. So this is a good way of starting. Now, so that's first of all one thing. You want to generally do that up front. And second of all, again, kind of like we talked about with Bourget, when Fanthorpe's not in the movie, but when Fanthorpe answers this one question, your reasons for visiting this country, and Fanthorpe just gives this pause, this awkward answer, pleasure. Again, listen. Listen, because if you hear something weird, you got to dig into it. You got to ask. And Poirot actually totally misses it, and he just goes on, and he just he just assumes the answer on behalf of Fanthorpe instead of just asking, wait, what do you mean? Or like, hey, you know what? I just noticed. Is there something? You know, you pause for a moment there. What? Can you please tell me more about why you're here? Because of course, what ends up happening in the novel, that Fanthorpe he did not give a truthful answer. He was not there for pleasure. He was hiding something. Now, he wasn't the murderer or anything like that, but he had an agenda, and Poirot missed it, right? And that's the kind of thing that obviously would have been important for establishing the credibility and figuring out things out. Okay, there's more we could talk about for these interviews, and please take a look at the handouts for that. But I thought we would wrap up. There's a few things I want to cover for wrap up. But first, I have a question for Dean. Something we were thinking about talking about earlier is, I think Poirot's interviews are not very good in general. But are there examples of interviews that you think, for people to see how it's done well? I mean, are there movies or TV shows that you would recommend that people check out to see how this is done well?
Yeah, I think there are, in fact, in the book that I wrote about interviewing, I do some case studies where I break down some interviews that I feel either went really well or went really badly. There are a couple of wonderful ones that are available online that anybody could find. There's a wonderful one between Chris Wallace when he was still with Fox News and Bill Clinton about the Clinton Global Initiative, and it's like two heavyweight fighters in the ring, both of them vying for control of this interview. But you get a sense of how prepared Chris Wallace really was for that, and it felt like an interrogation, but only from Bill Clinton's direction, So there are some good ones. I think the Jonathan Swan interview of President Trump about COVID response, he's with Axios, that he really held the president's feet to the fire without being a jerk about it. And there's another wonderful one of Megyn Kelly with Alex Jones from InfoWars. So those are really good interviews. If you can find the interview with Oprah and Meghan and Harry, that's a really, really good interview. That is such a well-crafted interview on her part. But there are also some wonderful movies. My go-to is the movie Almost Famous. It's just a marvelous, you think it's a movie about rock and roll, but it's actually a movie about interviewing. There's another one called The End of the Tour, which is about David Foster Wallace. And maybe really the one that would be most applicable to what you've talked about today, Stephen, would be Frost Nixon, where you see the David Frost character really evolve and become a wonderful interviewer by the end of the movie. He starts out horribly, deer in the headlights kind of thing, and then you just see him become more and more confident as it goes on. Or that Mr. Rogers movie, Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. That movie is about his relationship with a reporter from Esquire magazine, and there are some marvelous interview scenes in there as well. Those would be my recommendations.
Great. I think we're about I think we're a little past time, but just to wrap up, I think it's going to get a final practical pointers, especially for the lawyers. So, first, I guess one big point I'll throw out there is because I think Dean's talked about this already too. You doing an interview, to the extent you can, you want to prepare in advance. You really want to have a good sense of preparation is really important for interviews. But I've also seen lawyers go too far. And I have seen lawyers go too far when they don't have, go so far as to basically have a script rather than an outline. And so I think sometimes, and you end up getting, I've seen people be way too wedded to their script and actually not listen to the witness because they're so wedded to the script. I think it's useful to have an outline. I try to keep it kind of at a high level because I don't want to lock myself in, and I want to be very open to listening to the person as I'm talking to them. Second of all, I think it is really useful to think about the federal rules of evidence when you do these interviews, especially for lawyers. You want to think about admissibility. You want to think about asking the foundation questions because those are really important. Those help govern whether you're going to even be able to use this information later on. Again, if they don't have personal knowledge, it's kind of useless. You want to, when you're hearing about people talking about what someone else said, you want to clarify, is it actual words or is it their interpretation of someone's words? Because it can make a huge difference. And you do see tone matter a lot. I had one case where actually it kind of was like this my cousin Vinny moment, where someone said something kind of as a question mark, but the interview report left kind of didn't capture the tone, and that caused actually a lot of problems down the road. And you want to make sure when you do an interview, and this goes back to the federal rules of evidence, you want to make sure that you record the interview pretty quickly afterward. You have your notes, write up the memo to file quickly so that you can actually use it later on. One thing to keep in mind is that when you do an interview in a litigation or something like that, you're not just doing it for the day. You're doing this for 2 years down the road when you're prepping for trial or doing trial. And you're doing it for future you, okay? So writing down your notes, things like that can be very useful, and it helps you even get the evidence in, because if you can have, you can get around some of the hearsay rules if your memory is not as good 2 years from now, but you have a good memo that you wrote at the time. So really important to keep those in mind. I hope this has been useful, and I wish we had more time to talk, but I hope you've all enjoyed it. Lisa, maybe wrap up?
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank all of our participants for joining us today. Thank you to Stephen and Dean for your very, very wise words of wisdom with respect to interviewing. I want to thank Lisa Jackson and Lily Silva, as well as President Judge Nagel, Elizabeth Eckel, Aaron Franzblau, and the attendees at the networking reception and movie screening, including past President Michael Rothstein and the judges that were present. I look forward to attending many events with you all in person and virtually, and I hope that you have a wonderful afternoon. Goodbye, everyone.